Should have brought my Excedrin. Okay, so, I don't think I've got, did I put it in the wrong? No, I didn't. Oh well. I was out of luck today. Okay. So we ended with this last time. Just as a final reminder, your first paper is due next class. So, if you're going to turn it in physically, bring it in next Wednesday, or this Wednesday, next class. If you can't get it printed out, that's fine. Email it to me. Those of you that are listening online, don't try to bring it in physically unless like you're in the Lake City area and that's what you want to do. But if you're online, you're more than welcome to email it to me at my Francis Marion email. Yeah, it's due Wednesday, so get that to me, please. If you don't, that's an easy 0, so don't do that, please. Any questions before we start? Okay, so unfortunately the timing has gone a little bit poorly, and it's sort of looking like we will be finishing this chapter either today or Wednesday. And if we finish it Wednesday, we will be doing that with just like a couple of slides left, which will mean review day is going to be like Wednesday. And next week is spring break. So the test will be when we get back from spring break, which isn't ideal. But also, for the sake of timing, like I can't really give us another review day like when we get back. So I don't know, we're going to figure it out, but that's where we are right now. So that's just what's going to happen. So for those of you that are listening, let's do the thing. So, we talked about progressive social reform, social control, prohibition, all this stuff, prohibitionists, this whole thing, all these crazy posters I found, and did eventually lead to prohibition being passed, January 16, 1919. Charles here. Who else is here? Graham Newsom. Okay. So, the next section, after prohibition, was this push to end prostitution, but there were a number of reasons for this. Prohibition was more about how people felt about alcohol. Prostitution was a multifaceted issue. There was, of course, the issue of STDs because, that was a health issue. But also the virtue of the women involved. McClure's magazine ran a report on prostitution in Chicago calling it white slavery, though, of course, Black and Asian women were also subjected to prostitution, which often dealt with human trafficking. So by 1915, All states had laws against sexual solicitation. Let me get Mr. Here we are. The White Slave Trade Act in 1910 by Representative James Mann. So the act that specifically forbade prostitution was known as the Mann Act, because of course it was. However, this had multiple parts to it and also was meant to enforce traditional racial behavior because, of course, this is the early 1900s and people are ultra racist. In 1910, Jack Johnson, an African-American boxer, defeated the heavyweight champion Jim Jeffries. Lots of people were very racist about it. By 1913, he was prosecuted on moral charges due to his relations with white women because, 1910, I guess. Yeah. What else? Oh yes, narcotics. 250,000 Americans were addicted to opium, morphine, or cocaine. As I've said in many of my classes before, if you ever wonder, if you ever take a literature class and you read, if you ever read Edgar Allan Poe's stuff and wonder what his writing was about, opium. He was on lots of opium because it was legal back then. You just smoked opium all the time. So that's what was going on. So the Harrison Narcotics Control Act of 1914 banned narcotics except for medicinal purposes. So you could still get it, just, you had to get it to a doctor. Right. So we have these various, dramatic, oh no, the great war on white slavery are fighting for the protection of our girls because, the only people we were concerned about are the white girls that are involved in this. Ignorance is no longer innocence. Fighting the traffic in young girl, for God's sakes, do something, says General Booth. The war on white slavery. The greatest crime in the world's history. Not the literal enslavement of generations of people for hundreds of years. No, it's this thing because it's white girls. Not an entire group of people because of the melanin in their skin. And again, we're just going to ignore the other groups of people that are going through the exact same thing because of their ethnicity. Here again, this one is surprisingly sympathetic towards immigrants. Friends meeting an immigrant girl at the docks. This girl met in New York by two, quote, friends who took her in charge. These friends are two of the most brutal of all the white slave traders who are in the traffic. Foreign girls are more helplessly at the mercy of white slave hunters than girls at home. Every year, thousands of girls arriving in America from Italy, Sweden, Germany, etc., are never heard of again. Now, I'm surprised it goes as far east as Italy. But Sweden and Germany certainly make sense. You don't see, Poland or Russia or anything like that. It's like, we don't worry about them. But oh no, not the Swedes or the Germans. They're good white girls. We do have another creepy octopus, though, so that's fun. Got the Vice Octopus in Chicago. I do love the creepy octopus with the big googly eyes. Someone was paid to draw this. I love it. Anyway, here's the Jack Johnson, Jim Jeffries boxing match. Dude got laid out. Speaking of immigrants, anti-immigration stuff again. Perception that immigrants were inherently immoral because obviously social scientists saw immigrants as racially inferior. A lot of religious bigotry. Catholics and Jews were seen as something dangerous to Christianity, which, like, do they not know how any of this works? Like, Catholicism was where Christianity started, and Christianity came from Judaism. Like, do you know your history, boys? Do you know how any of this works? Anyway, obviously, when it came to immigrants, the worst that got it were the Asians. We talked about that Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 because that was, that's something, I think we even talked about that or we would have talked about it in 101 towards the end of the semester because we mentioned like the move west, and it's like, oh yeah, by the way, Chinese immigrants got the worst of it. 1908, Theodore Roosevelt entered into a restricted immigration agreement with Japan. This wasn't the same as the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act was just the United States saying no more immigrants from China, and those that are here can't be citizens. The limited immigration agreement with Japan was because, and still kind of to this day, the Japanese government is very insular and does not like immigration in either direction. They don't want people from outside Japan coming in. They don't want people inside Japan going out because they don't really have a very steady birth rate. And so obviously, if there's a lot of people leaving Japan and going to America, they're more than happy to enter into an agreement with the president to limit their people going to America. So that was less like the government just broadly keeping them out, and more Japan, at least the government of Japan, was like, hey, we don't want our people leaving. How about you restrict them and we'll restrict from our side too. However, state governments in the United States were not content with less Japanese coming in. In California in 1913, they barred all Japanese immigrants from buying land, which makes it very difficult to make any money when the main source of income is farming for most people. And 12 other states soon followed this idea of just like making it so Japanese can't buy land, or people who look Japanese, because people are just racist. You don't have to be a Japanese citizen or former Japanese citizen or Japanese American. Just, hey, you don't look like us, therefore you can't buy land. And then Congress in 1917 just decided to ban a bunch of people they felt like weren't going to be good American citizens. Illiterates who could not read English or their native language, entry to other desirables like, and this is quoting from the book, which I think was itself quoting, this is quoting the actual legislation. Alcoholics, feeble-minded persons, epileptics, people mentally or physically defective, professional beggars, whatever the hell that is, anarchists and polygamists. So they kept out those that could not support themselves and might become a public ward of the state. In the case of anarchists and polygamists, people who threaten the nation's political and religious values. So, you know, those that were seen as a burden or a potential danger. Here we have the old skeleton in the closet, which again will stick around until World War II. Protests against Russia exclusion of Jewish Americans, while America is continuing to exclude the Chinese. And boy, we have a lot of these. Pacific chivalry, encouragement to Chinese immigration. What we would like to see, yeah, this is from the Waltz, which I guess, is that actually just white Anglo-Saxon Protestant? Was that what the journal was called? My God. Okay. Korea was in a bad place. This was Korea during the Russo-Japanese War. They decided to be neutral, though geographically they were not in a real good place to be neutral. As someone with a lot of Irish heritage, I identify with this. This is a very pro-Anglo look at the Irish. So you've got the Irishman here. My God, that's loud. Sitting on a gunpowder barrel, Uncle Sam's gunpowder, bottle of rum in one hand, torch in the other. I mean, there were still a lot of like Sinn Féin terrorists hanging around. This might have been around the time when the Irish tried to cause the war in Canada to get the United States to fight England again for the sake of Ireland. So I don't know. This might not be entirely unfounded, but it's a little much. Here we have the literacy test. You're welcome in if you can climb the wall, which again is, you know, the land of the free, if you can get in. The only way to handle it, cutting off immigration. So, on to like municipal state reform. So reform at the city level. Because as we've seen, the political machines and the city bosses weren't really going to cut it. They were full of graft and corruption, and that just wasn't going to work. I actually probably would have an example here, but we made that example president, so I don't know if it would work anymore. So we had the Commission Form of Government. This actually came about in 1900 after Galveston, Texas was wiped out in a hurricane, and the mayor and city council were not able to respond quickly enough because, well, the city was largely destroyed. And, you know, the city bosses and whatnot weren't really able to do anything about it. So they elected commissioners who each ran the municipal departments like a business. And very quickly, by very quickly, within 17 years, this form of government had taken hold in more than 400 cities, which, you know, across the United States isn't a ton, but, you know, multiple cities in each state, I'd suppose. Now, you can't be lucky enough to have every city destroyed by a hurricane in order to overthrow the political machines. So to get rid of these political machines electorally, they used direct elections so that the politicians wouldn't be selecting the civil leaders, because again, that's what a lot of what was going on, where the politicians were the ones who were selecting those in charge as opposed to the people. Also at large elections, where the votes ran across the entire city rather than by district. In other words, avoid the gerrymandering that is everything today. So the various city and state governments helped the working class, women, and children. By 1913, 3/4 of the states had ratified the 17th Amendment, which made senators elected by popular vote, which again, if you recall, was something that the populace had put forward way back when, which is to say like 2 chapters ago. And again, the idea of you actually elect your state senators was not a thing more than 100 years ago now. And because I like, well, I should find a better way to say this. Because I find extreme weather interesting, especially when it comes to hurricanes, because, I mean, we all live this close to the coast. I've got a lot of images from the Galveston hurricane aftermath. And oh boy, Galveston got rocked. I mean, it looks like a war zone. Yeah, buildings, the buildings that were still together weren't on their foundations anymore. You had boats inland, and just everywhere was this like sea of debris, because a lot of the buildings and I guess piers probably were just disintegrated and pushed inland. Which is why during extreme weather events like this, you don't want to be in the water, because there's stuff in there besides water, and it will kill you. And so, of course, once they rebuilt the city, they also put up a big-ass storm wall. And then add this, electing the Senate in direct democracy before the 17th Amendment, which was apparently a whole bunch of chaos. All right. Also, government progressivism, conservation and preservation. So there was some environmental stuff. Gifford Pinchot, forester in the Department of Agriculture, emphasized the efficient use of the natural environment, efficient use of resources. And large lumber companies were cool with this because renewable logging, you know, not just clear cutting a forest, but going through and only cutting down certain trees and replanting where you did cut, that was expensive. And smaller lumber companies could not afford that, so they were run out of business. So sure, they would pay a little extra money to cut out the competitors. However, the efficient use of land and resources for the good of people was challenged in 1906 during the 1906 California earthquake, which was another natural disaster that I remember doing a lot of reading and research on in like elementary school. That's something that I was real big into as a child, apparently. Massive water and power shortages. Also set most of San Francisco on fire because of gas lines. So the officials in San Francisco requested the construction of a hydroelectric dam and reservoir in the Hetch Hetchy Valley in Yosemite National Park. Pinchot decided this was a good idea because it benefited a lot of people, and while it did use a certain amount of natural resources and land, well, again, it benefited a lot of people because it's San Francisco. However, John Muir, who was in charge of Yosemite, was against it. He called it ravaging commercialism. I've actually got a quote here in the book. Here we go. Dam Hetch Hetchy, Muir exclaimed, as well damned for water tanks, the people's cathedrals and churches, for no holier temple has ever been constructed by the heart of man. After a bruising 7-year battle, Pinchot, by this time a private citizen, triumphed. So Pinchot finally won, but this victory did spur environmentalism into the political sphere. So the idea of preservation versus conservation became a political concern rather than just something that nobody really cared about. Of course, though, the argument at all was how it would affect white Americans, not the Mono Lake Puates? I've still not figured out how to pronounce that. The Native Americans who lived in Yosemite Valley and had to actually be completely moved because, well, as you're about to see, Hetch Hetchy Valley was completely flooded in order to make this reservoir, because that's how reservoirs work. So, some images of San Francisco after the earthquake, which, as you can see, not the best looking San Francisco's ever been. I mean, it looks like a city that's been bombed in World War II. And there it is, like immediately after the earthquake when things are still on fire. And also they couldn't do anything about the fire because all the water mains have been broken too due to the earthquake. So like, it busted the natural gas lines, which caught on fire, and also busted the water lines so they couldn't actually put anything out. It was real bad news. There was very little to be done. Again, this looks like this is like pictures I'll be showing you guys in World War II. Some of the reconstruction, with still a bunch of debris laying in the road. So here's Hetch Hetchy Valley prior to the building of the dam, the reservoir. You've got the river itself and a lot of the wetlands around it, and then of course the mountain in the background. Actually, you can even see the waterfall back there. I realize I'm pointing at a picture while I've got an online class listening. And there it is today. It's actually roughly the same area. I'll show you guys a side-by-side here in just a second. Yeah, so this is basically the same area. It's a little more to the right in the second one, but this is the same image, but with this area flooded. So any people who were living down here obviously had to leave because they're going to be underwater. There's a hydroelectric dam doing its thing, making power. This is a picture of this in the book. Gentleman there on the right, on the left is of course Teddy Roosevelt. On the right is John Moore. They are atop Glacier Point in Yosemite Valley. It mentions that Moore founded the Sierra Club, which I had some kind of little thing for when I was a small child. I knew about the Sierra Club. Convinced Roosevelt to place Yosemite under federal control, which led to the establishment of a national park in 1906. So when we talk more about Roosevelt, next chapter, I think. Talk about him a little bit in this chapter here in just a minute. He was the one that set up, we will talk about him in just a minute, about national parks. Yeah, he was the one that set up the nation's first national parks. The first one was Yellowstone, of course, but Yosemite was right behind it. All right, so, under Teddy Roosevelt. So, Teddy Roosevelt, let's see, born in New York, graduated from Harvard in 1880, assistant secretary in 1897, formed the Rough Riders the next year to fight in Cuba, became the governor of New York the same year, William McKinley's vice president in 1900, and president after McKinley was assassinated the next year. So, a lot of stuff very quickly. I mean, between graduating from Harvard and becoming the assistant secretary, that's, 17 years. But between becoming the assistant secretary of the Navy and becoming president, that's a very short period of time. So assistant secretary in 97, Rough Riders in 98, governor also in 98, after Rough Riders. So he took no time between Rough Riders and becoming governor of New York. And then 2 years later, William McKinley's vice president, and then the year after that, president because McKinley got shot. So, not missing a step, Roosevelt decided to not be a passive administrator, but to use the presidency as his bully pulpit, promote the reforms and rally public opinion. And despite being rather boisterous, Roosevelt's reforms were pretty moderate. This is something I mentioned way at the start of this chapter. He preferred more moderate reforms, didn't like things to be ideologically extreme in either direction. I mean, he did push for reforms. He was about, things changing for the better, the Food and Drug Administration and the EPA, not having the Chicago River catch on fire every other week. That's probably a good thing. But he also didn't want things to get too out of hand. What he saw, out of hand for 1900s. Political and economic stability, this is what he called the square deal. That was, again, something that we saw in the suffrage movement posters, them talking about a square deal that was referencing Teddy Roosevelt here. Mediating a coal mine strike, using the Sherman Antitrust Act against business trust. So, using antitrust acts against business trust. What a surprise. Using acts for what they were meant for. Such as the Northern Securities Company in 1902, facing down J.P. Morgan, also Standard Oil. Let me read a quick quote from the book. Northern Securities was a railroad company, if I remember right. Yeah. held monopoly control over northernmost transcontinental railway lines. The powerful financier behind Northern Securities, J.P. Morgan, believed that he could do business with Roosevelt as he had with previous presidents. "Send your man to my man and they can fix it up," Morgan informed Roosevelt. However, the president's man at the Justice Department responded, "We don't want to fix it up, we want to stop it." In 1904, the Supreme Court ordered the Northern Securities Company be dissolved, ruling the firm had restricted competition. So, yeah, Roosevelt started with J.P. Morgan, you know, one of the biggest guys on the block, and then just went from there. So in the course of his presidencies, I suppose, he technically won one term and finished out McKinley's. Filed 25 suits, so he had the title Trust Buster. It's one of his many titles. Here he is with the Rough Riders, one of his more popular depictions. Here he is, pointing menacingly. Also looks a lot like one of my professors before he shaved his goatee. This was actually something we'll talk about in a little bit, but another thing he did when it came to trust, he didn't go after every trust in America, which technically all the trusts were monopolies, and by law, he could shut down every trust he saw. But if Roosevelt saw the trust as not harming the economy, not harming the competition, he would allow it to exist as long as it had an agreement with the government that it would not go beyond what it was currently doing. For example, he had an agreement with U.S. Steel that it would continue doing business as it was and not expand to harm other businesses. So there were what he called good trusts that he kept on a leash, so to speak, while he did shut down bad trusts that harmed competition. So here we have, I guess that's this guy in the Justice Department. Cornelius? I don't know. Putting the screws on the truss. And there he is in the window, grinning like a madman. What's amazing to me is you get these cartoon depictions of the various presidents. And you've got the one here of Roosevelt. But then you look at an actual picture of Roosevelt, and it's like, no, that's just what he looked like. Like, he just looks like a cartoon character. That's just him. There he is fighting the train trust, I guess. This one's actually like a realistic looking picture of Roosevelt, just like a regular dude fighting a train monster. It's horrifying. There he is, swinging the big stick. This one's a bit overdramatic. Railroad trust, oil trust. Can't see what the other trust is. Everything in general on the other side there. It's like, that's overdramatic. He wasn't that big. There's the various big trusts looking down on Roosevelt before he tears into them. There on the right, reaching his hand down, that's J.P. Morgan. All right, more Theodore Roosevelt, because I think he's interesting and there's a lot to talk about with Theodore Roosevelt. So I got 2 slides. He was very popular. He won the presidency in 1904, which was technically his first term, because again, finishing out McKinley's term didn't count as his first term. But it certainly helped him already be very popular because everybody already knew what he was capable of. He beat Judge Alton Parker. You don't need to know Judge Alton Parker, considering I completely screw up his name while looking at the name. Obviously, with this term, he was very secure with the knowledge that the people were behind him, very vigorous in fighting railroad corruption, set maximum shipping rates, outlawing rebates, which, as we had seen, favor big businesses. Set a middle ground between conservationists and preservationists, which, again, as we saw a couple of slides ago, conservationists wanted to use land for the good of the people, while preservationists wanted to keep land pristine for the environment. So he set aside 150 million acres of timberland as national forests and spent $80 million in federal funds constructing dams, reservoirs, canals, and such in the West. I should mention that one of the reasons that Teddy Roosevelt wanted national parks was because he was such an outdoorsy type. He liked to hunt. I mean, if you know anything about Teddy Roosevelt, you should know he liked to hunt. And the reason he wanted national parks was because he recognized that a lot of these animals were going extinct, and he's like, we need to have these parks so that the animals can have a safe place to be and multiply so that we can hunt them later, but they need a safe place to be away from hunters. Which, like, as a small child, I didn't quite understand. I was like, oh, well, hunters just, like, kill the animals, right? Like, I didn't understand the idea of, you know, keeping them separate. But actually, what was I? It was a class I taught upstate. There's a duck hunting club, organization, something or other, that's like nationwide. And they fund like heated ponds up north so that ducks have a place to land and like rest during their migrations. And it like has a positive impact on the population sizes for the ducks. And so that they do a lot of duck conservation and like breeding programs and stuff to keep the ducks in high population, so that they can be able to hunt ducks without negatively affecting the numbers of ducks in the wild. It's pretty interesting. So anyway, it wasn't all Teddy Roosevelt. Congress also did a bunch of stuff during his presidency. Bit of reform in 1906. This was the year Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, which I briefly mentioned at the start of the chapter. It's called the dangerous, filthy conditions that the workers had under the meatpacking industry that caused Europe to refuse to buy canned meat from the U.S. because it was gross. And they're like, yeah, we're not going to buy your poisoned-ass meat if y'all can't fix this. So the Meat Inspection Act was passed, which helped consumers because, hey, we're not getting poisoned by meat anymore, yay. But shut out smaller meat packing businesses because they couldn't afford new standards, which, like, normally I would feel bad for the small businesses, but at the same time, I don't want your tainted-ass meat. Oh, we're a small business, we can't afford the regulations on not poisoning our customers. Well, too bad. At this point, I'm sorry, but too bad. I mean, maybe the government could, you know, do some kind of small business loan on food and safety standards. I don't know, but I'm going to go for safety before mom and pop meat packing. Anyway, Congress also passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, prohibited sale of adulterated and fraudulently labeled food and medicine, which is also nice, you know. So when you get food and medicine, it has what it says in it. Even though, you know, you still have weirdos today. It's like, we don't know what's in the vaccines. Like, it says it on the thing. You freaking weirdo. Anyway, here's Teddy Roosevelt petting a pelican. Which, the more I learn about pelicans, the more I wonder about this image, because pelicans are mean. They can fit your entire head in their mouth, and they will try. See, I don't know what's going on with this pelican. It might be sick. Or it might just understand what Teddy Roosevelt is, and it's just like, I'm not even going to try. Conservation means development as much as it does protection. So he's lumping conservation and preservation in together, which is fair. I mean, in my mind, they're kind of both. I recognize the right and duty of this generation to develop and use the natural resources of our land, but I do not recognize the right to waste them or to rob by wasteful use the generations that come after us. Yeah, I always understood conservation as the balancing of both, the balancing of using natural resources, but also preserving as much as you can. You know, not just like clear cutting the forest, but also not just like fencing off the forest. It's like, all right, we just can't touch any of this ever. So here's some horrifying images of meatpacking plants. There's pork cutting. When you didn't have machines, you just had dudes with big-ass knives. You don't want to get involved in that. Why is... Okay, what kind of optical illusion is happening here? Why is that guy's head behind that guy's arm? I just noticed that. What's going on? All right, I'm going to go to the next one because I don't want to look at that anymore. Beef. They're just splitting the carcass. One of my favorite images, cocaine toothache drops. Got a toothache, take you some cocaine, you won't be feeling it anymore. For sale by all druggists. You'll get you some, this is before the term pharmacist came out. So you go to the local druggist and get you some cocaine toothache drops. Coca-Cola satisfies the thirsty, helps the weary. No, Coca-Cola is not made with cocaine. That's an overgeneralization. But yes, it was made with the same active ingredient, of the same base ingredient. They didn't like refine cocaine into the powder and then dump it into the barrels, but it was made from the same plant. So it's got the same basic ingredient, but it's not like they made cocaine powder and then dump it into the barrels of, you know, the cola. But it was made from the same coca plant. All right, next president. Taft. Roosevelt was getting bored of being president, so he decided not to run in 1908. Because he could have, because again, that would have technically been his second term. So he backed William Howard Taft, who easily defeated William Jennings Bryan. We talked about William Jennings Bryan like, it feels like forever ago. I mean, technically it was just a couple of chapters, but I guess it hasn't been that long in years. It's weird that he's still around. Anyway, Taft was not Roosevelt. I mean, obviously, if everybody likes Roosevelt, and he's just like, hey, so I'm bored of being president, but I'm backing this guy. And everybody's like, well, okay, we're going to vote this guy because he's got Roosevelt's backing. Well, Roosevelt didn't pick a good horse. 1909, there was a session of Congress that was supposed to support lower tariffs. However, Republicans opposed him, and he ended up signing the Payne-Aldrich tariff into law, which completely went against what was supposed to be going on in this particular session. Taft fired Pinchot for criticizing his Secretary of the Interior for returning these restricted Alaskan coal mines to private miners, which again was very much against conservation, because if you're keeping them restricted, then you're able to control their use and decrease the, or use your words, limit the environmental impact. But if you just like hand it out to private miners, it's going to get out of control. Now, Taft did do a lot for conservation, but Roosevelt was very unhappy with how Taft handled this issue with Pinchot, because it was over a criticism, not even like anything Pinchot actually did. And a lot of people, as we're going to see with some of these images here in a minute, a lot of people were following what Taft was up to and really did not like this Pinchot dismissal. So Roosevelt was on safari in Africa and then did a speaking tour in Europe, because Europeans were very interested in this strange American president who was very different from presidents in the past. So he went across Europe and, gave talks and whatnot. And began attacking Taft for filing antitrust legislation against U.S. Steel, which, as I mentioned, Roosevelt had made deals with because they were seen as not being harming the economy. Taft instead just went against any trust he saw. Despite being known as a trust buster, Taft actually filed a lot more trusts than Roosevelt did, but he wasn't as discriminatory. So here's Taft. If I recall correctly, I think he's the one that got stuck in the bathtub, supposedly. It's another one of those maybe stories. There's Harper's Weekly telling Taft you'd look much better in your old clothes. Taft trying to follow Teddy Roosevelt's way of doing things, which not quite working out. This is obviously a bit of an over-exaggeration. I mean, yeah, Taft was a big guy, but Roosevelt wasn't small. Roosevelt was a stocky guy. And here we have Taft avoiding the newspapers. The very first one up there, Pinchot was not insubordinate. He was fired unjustifiably. Secretary Wilson didn't understand. So apparently Wilson's already, making rounds. We'll talk about Wilson at the very end, which we might not get to today. We'll finish that up on Wednesday. So here's Taft. In Daddy's footsteps, sure, but going the wrong way. And the most recent one, Pinchot case. Everybody's very irritated about that. Apparently there was a whole thing trying to keep Roosevelt out of the country, saying that he and his people might have the sleeping sickness from Africa, and that it might just be incubating and not showing up yet. The sleeping sickness was I'm not sure what the proper term is today. But it was, some kind of tropical disease. We're not done yet. Obviously, he'd done a speaking tour in Europe, so it didn't last very long for them to try to quarantine him. This is a thing we're going to see a lot of for some reason. Taft as a very disgruntled maid, and Teddy Roosevelt also looking very disgruntled. There's a lot of this. I don't know why. This is a weird time for presidents, y'all. All right, election of 1912. Yeah, we're in the 1900s now. Brain. Okay. So, Roosevelt has got us to the 1900s now, and I need to get my brain in gear. So, Roosevelt wanted to run again to fix things because, Taft happened. However, Taft still had the majority of the political machinery and beat Roosevelt in the primaries. So Roosevelt's like, fine, screw it. I'm going to make my own party. And he did. The Progressive Party, or this is also known as the Bull Moose Party, because Roosevelt said he felt as fit as a bull moose. I want to say this was after he got shot in the chest during a speech and then kept going for like 30 minutes. Because Roosevelt just don't give a fuck. Yeah. Felt as strong as a bull moose, which became the nickname. Yeah, okay. This wasn't after he got shot. But he did get shot in the chest while giving a speech. And then after the dude got grabbed and they were trying to get Teddy off to the hospital, he's like, no, I'm fine. I'm going to keep giving my speech. And he did give a speech while bleeding. Because the bullet didn't get past his ribs. But then once he got done with the speech, he went to the hospital. So he accepted the idea of new nationalism. Government should work for the social justice and the good of the people. So this Bull Moose Party advocated income, inheritance taxes, 8-hour workday, abolition of child labor, workers' comp, less restriction on labor unions, women's suffrage. Jane Addams was on board. During the creation of his Bull Moose Party, Pinchot was also there, so all his old allies were on board with him, as well as, again, Jane Addams, the hero from the beginning of the chapter. Meanwhile, the Democrats had Woodrow Wilson. His platform was that of the New Freedom, often an alternative to Roosevelt's plan. He was born in Virginia. The government needed to be more limited, healthy competition between businesses, and also rejected the idea of women's suffrage and the abolition of child labor. Because, the children yearn for the mines. That's apparently a joke now. Not in a lot of states now. They're trying to, put children in the meatpacking plants and the mines. That's not a joke anymore. Anyway, Eugene V. Debs was the Socialist Party candidate, so there were 4 people on the docket, and Wilson won 43% of the vote. Wilson and Taft split the Republicans. Eugene V. Debs was there. Here's Roosevelt with a moose head. Don't worry about him. Apparently the Bull Moose Party has a website that exists. Look at the moose with the moose with his glasses and teeth is just concerning. he is pointing menacingly again. There's Wilson. I would assume that's him throwing the first pitch, but he's not on the mound. He's just like in the audience. I don't know what's going on there. There's Wilson. There's Debs and Seidel. Okay, we will finish the chapter with Wilson and the conclusion next time. I'll see y'all on Wednesday, and we'll do the study guide on Wednesday too, because that's all we got left.